much indeed. Good evening, everybody. It's lovely to see you all. And I'm just going to get rid of that from my screen. And it's lovely to be here. I was on the committee of Practice Midlands years ago, and it's lovely to come back, albeit virtually. I spot two or three people here today who know me, so they already know that I am a crushing disappointment in almost all contexts where I speak, but the rest of you will discover that as we go along. But it's lovely to be here. And what I'm going to really do tonight is to kind of set the context for the next two evenings, which are going to drill a bit deeper into some of the specifics of online worship, worship online, and the sort of possibilities of mixed mode worship that we might be living in, quite possibly for the next months or even years to go. Emma's asked me to take a step back from that and start from first principles tonight, and really think about what worship is. And I think that's a really good thing for us to do regularly anyway. What do we actually think that worship is before we kind of work out how to reimagine it for the next season of our life? We do it all the time. We're a mixture, I guess, of clergy and laity here, involved in either leading worship or being led in worship. I'm retired now. I lead very little worship, particularly this year, because I'm also have been shielding. I've been in this room for 7 of the last 12 months, which is a very odd existence to have. And I'm mostly led in worship now in retirement in the congregations that I worship in. But whether we lead or are led or both, we sort of do it all the time, don't we? We go to church, or at least until this time last year, we would rock up on a Sunday and be at church, and then suddenly our world changed. And the Church of England and Christians, I think more widely than that, have had to really ask some questions about what is it that we're doing when we worship, and which bits of that have we lost as a result of the circumstances of the past year. What is transferable and what isn't? Some of those really fundamental questions, and that's where I'd like to start tonight. And then I'm basically going to pump prime your conversations in groups, and then we can drill into some of the detail in the questions, if you like. As Emma said, I've done leading worship and being led in worship, and I hope some worshipping in amongst those other things, in rural and suburban and urban contexts. And yet, when I stop to think, well, actually, what is it that we're doing? What is this enterprise called worship? I do find it's well worth coming back to those first principles again. And so beginning really by defining worship is not a bad way to go. And I'm not going to use my own definitions because of the crushing disappointment I spoke about earlier. I'm going to instead draw particularly on the writings of Michael Perham, who many of you will either have known personally or know his writing. And those of you who know me won't be surprised that Michael is where I go as my first port of call always. And then also on a little bit of the liturgical theology of David Fagerberg as well, an American liturgical theologian who can help us, I think. So what I'm going to do now is attempt to share my screen, which is where the first moment of crushing disappointment might happen, or it might not. Can you see this? I see some nods, brilliant. And then when I do that, it should get big. Does that look good, Emma? I can still see you. Brilliant. Okay, so we are going to think a bit about access to God, access to each other in worship. And this is where I want to start, really, which is what do we mean by worship, and how does it relate to some of these other words that we use a lot when we're in and around church and in and around other clergy and so on, things like prayer or liturgy. What is worship and what isn't it? And I think the first definition that I go to, for actually way back into my Christian Union days, down at Sussex University, is worship is offering God his worth. That's the derivation of the word, of course, isn't it? But worship is set in the broader context of a whole life talking to God, and God hopefully talking to us. Um, and when we begin to talk about worship which is communal, then that's when the church, of course, starts using the language of liturgy. So I think what I'm doing initially is I'm holding these three these three uh, uh, words that describe different ways of being with God, and we're holding the whole life of the Christian life of prayer, and then we're seeing what that it looks like when it becomes something we might want to call worship, and then what that looks like when we might want to describe it as liturgy. Um, and I think we get close to a definition of this when we think about what it is that we do together. And here then is the first bit of Michael Perham for the evening. You will recognise, many of you, this quotation. Worship, says Michael Perham. Those of you who don't know, Michael Perham was Bishop of Gloucester. Before that, he was Dean of Derby and Precentor of Norwich, and wrote most of Common Worship alongside David Stancliffe and Michael Vasey. And Michael just oozed prayer. Those of us who had the privilege of working alongside him, he kind of inhabited prayer in a way that was quite inspirational, at the same time as being just as problematic as all bishops are. So I'm not hagiographing him. But Michael says worship is the offering to God of praise, glory, and honor in reverence and in love. It is something that can be done in community or alone, in church, or in 1,000 other contexts. So Michael wraps up praise, glory, honor, reverence, love, and he describes the offering of that to God as worship. And he notes that you can do that anyway. You can do it on the bus, you can do it in the shed, you can do it in the swimming pool. Um, uh, and then he goes on to say, well, what happens when we try to do that together? What happens when, rather than an individual Christian talking to God, we attempt to become the church? And then he goes on to say this. He talks about liturgy being effectively interchangeable as a term with corporate worship. So for Michael, liturgy means the people of God worshipping together. And he describes it as such when he says, liturgy is that subtle blend of word, song, movement, gesture, and silence that enables the people of God to worship together. And I think that's our way in to thinking about worship, and therefore is going to roll on into your next two conversations, because that word together is vital, isn't it? Because we're not at the moment, or at least we're not in the same way that we were before. And then Michael Perham goes on to say, the liturgy is the way into the church's corporate worship of God, the Father of our Lord Jesus Christ. Worship is what we do because we want to offer God his worth. And when we try to do that together, it becomes this subtle blend of all these wonderful things: word, song, movement, gesture, and silence, that enables the people of God to worship together. And corporate worship is really what the rest of this evening is about. How is it that we talk to God together? How is it that we are in God's presence together? An awful lot of what I'm going to say, of course, then bangs up against the disjunction of the last year, because just looking at that definition from Michael Perham, well, how does that work when you can't worship together? And those of us who've been doing a lot of Zoom worship will know that trying to recreate song, particularly on Zoom, silence is not easy either, except when Molly's in charge and she just mutes you all, and so on. So wrestling with this definition of what it is to worship together is really interesting, I think, because something has happened over the past year which has stretched our understanding of what worship is. And I think a lot of that is to do with proximity, actually. And you'll go on to talk a lot more about this in the next couple of sessions, I'm sure. But that thing about together, what does it mean to be together? Because we used to know, we went into a building together and sat near each other, or, because we're Anglicans, sat not very near each other, but under the same roof. And we were together in space and we were together in time. And now we're not together in space. And if we're doing live worship, we're together-ish in time, though not quite, because we all know about the Zoom lag. But if we're recording worship for people to watch later, we're not together in space or time. And that's the interesting adventure that you'll go off down in the next couple of months. Here's just one other thought to finish the first half of my thought, and then I'll go on to the second half. A different person. This is David Fagerberg, who is an American liturgical theologian, absolutely fab. His book, What is Liturgical Theology, is oldish now, but it's really good. And he has this wonderful vision that actually what we do when we worship together is we create liturgical theology. In other words, what he says is liturgical theology, in other words, talking about God and worship, is not something that belongs in the academy. It's not something that belongs in even the august halls of Cuddesdon College. We don't do liturgical theology primarily when we sit and look at books and think about it. We do liturgical theology when we are together worshipping God. And he has this wonderful quotation where he says, the subject matter of liturgical theology is not liturgy, it is God, humanity, and the world. And the vortex in which these three existentially tangle is liturgy. And I just love that idea that when we worship together, God, humanity, and the world are swirling around and entangling together like a vortex. And what's being generated is theology. Whenever we meet and pray together, we are creating theology. And there are other liturgical theologians, particularly perhaps people like Aidan Kavanagh, the Roman Catholic liturgical theologian, who talk about this is the primary place where we do our theology. Theology is done by people being together, worshipping God and holding themselves before God and God before the world. So it's all again about gathering. It's about being together. It's about proximity, and it's about what happens when we do all those things together. And again, we have to ask questions, therefore, about that in our current season. What do we really mean by gathering? What do we mean by congregation? What do we mean by the ecclesia? Where is the congregation now? Who is the congregation? There are some other ways of thinking about what worship is, and you may recognize this slide, not least because actually it originated in a praxis manual a few 10 years, 20, 15 years ago. Worship is a balance, isn't it? Worship is a balance between a lot of things. And this is a quotation from New Patterns for Worship. And it says there are 4 different kinds of ingredients in worship, and it's important that there is a balance in the way these are used. And they are, and many of you will know this, I'm teaching grandmother to suck eggs. They are word, prayer, praise, and action. And again, how is that working now? How those of us who create worship are used to sort of balancing an act of worship. Is there enough in here of music, of silence, of scripture, of response of one sort or another? And we're having to do that differently now as well. We're having to perhaps think a bit deeper about what action might mean when everybody is physically separated from each other. We might be thinking a bit differently about how we praise, particularly. I think, one of the things that the Church of England has really struggled with over the last year is the embargo on singing. So we suddenly recognise, don't we, how much of our worship is in song and in music, and very peculiar. Christmas was weird, wasn't it? Sitting, listening to 3 people sing, Hark the Herald Angels Sing, and I found myself thinking, what am I doing when I listen to someone else sing a carol? that feels different from listening to the choir singing an anthem at evensong, but I don't know why, and that might be totally irrational. You know, I was presenter of Salisbury for 7.5 years. I listened to an anthem every night for 7.5 years. And yet listening to someone singing a carol felt different. And that's something about the expectation of participation, something about involvement and all these things. So how are we balancing worship? How is worship constructed in a way that maintains these important things about what worship should be? And again, you know, we're testing that and we're trying it. Michael Perham says often in his writing, and he said often in his ministry as well, that worship fundamentally is finding out what the angels are doing and joining in. He had the Sanctus, the holy, 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 was at the very heart of his entire sort of understanding of worship. This is a rather, you know, you'd expect a bitter old Anglo-Catholic to show a picture of someone celebrating the Mass facing east, but here is an image of someone celebrating the Eucharist, and the angels are there. They've come down and they are assisting with the consecration and the elevation and so on. Michael was very keen to keep saying, there are angels here, and actually the angels are already the experts in worship. You know, think about Revelation. Those are the visions of heavenly worship. There are angels, there are saints, and it's a song, isn't it? It's everybody singing. And Michael would regularly remind us that basically the purpose of a worship leader is to not get in the way of the angels, is to not block up the route between the angels and the people, and to try and help people into that moment where heaven meets earth. Here's a different way of looking at it. The dome of an Orthodox church traditionally, you will know, is an Orthodox church. The geography of an Orthodox church is a map of heaven, and at the top of the dome normally you find Christ Pantocrator, Christ the King, and around him angels, and again it's a way of trying to create a visual symbol of the fact that there is this heavenly host here already, up into which we ascend towards the heavens. Now, there are some ways in which we can block up the Sanctus. There are some ways in which we can make it harder for the angels to be heard. This is a cheap shot, really, because I'm a wheelchair user, but I'm going to say it anyway. Here is a church I can't get into because there are steps there. So on one level, when we're thinking about access to worship, we are thinking about physical access to worship. Do we have disabled access? Do we have hearing loops? Might we expect someone to come who would like to worship using Braille or British Sign Language or whatever? But the point is broad. All of those things are really important. You know, there are an awful lot of. I think I could only get into one of the 7 churches I used to be vicar of now, which is interesting. But one of the things that the pandemic, of course, has brought up is that there are a group of people who have been drawn back into worship, who were excluded previously because of physical inability to get into the building, and now suddenly live streaming is happening, and they are back in the building from which they have been excluded for a while, and the rediscovery or the discovery for the first time of things like the doctrine of spiritual communion, which I know divides people strongly, has gifted to some people who might only have received home communion once a month or you know, once a quarter, with a piece of liturgical and theological apparatus to make their communion every time the Eucharist is celebrated. So when we think about access, I think we're thinking about what has been gained by the pandemic, what has been lost by the pandemic, and in what ways are we as worship leaders actively involved in either allowing the Song of the Angels to sing, or indeed stifling it with other things. And that often involves looking quite hard at ourselves and makes us feel rather uncomfortable. I've got 2 more slides and then I'm going to finish. Michael Perham in his new handbook says it's a useful way of knowing about the worship in your place is if you were a stranger and you walked in for the first time, what might that stranger think the Sunday service is for? What's the purpose of it? And in his book, and I've given you the page reference there, he says, because you go to some churches and you might come away thinking that the main reason for that act of worship is evangelism. The purpose is to convert, to convict, to entice people into this relationship with God. There are other churches you might go to, and you might well feel, well, actually, the main purpose of this act of worship is teaching. It is very didactic. It's very oriented towards educating the congregation. And then there are other churches that you might go to, and you might well come away feeling that the main purpose of that act of worship on a Sunday is to build up and affirm and strengthen a community. And Michael says, well, actually, all of those things are good, but they're not actually the purpose of worship. He says the purpose of worship is transformation. And he goes on to say, the truth is that the deep purpose of worship is not to evangelize, nor to teach, nor to engender fellowship, but to be in touch with the living God. It is important to say that worship is for worship, not primarily for anything else. Worship is to enable us to reach up, to grasp the heel of heaven, to glimpse, albeit imperfectly and fleetingly, the life of heaven, to plug in for a moment to the worship of the angels and the praises of the saints. It's a wonderful, wonderful vision. And I think he's got something there. And I've applied this model to some of my own contexts. And I think, oh yeah, actually, I can see what he's saying. This might have felt rather like a community building exercise or an evangelistic enterprise. And it's really important to say Michael Perham is not saying any of these things are bad or wrong or naughty. They're all brilliant, but they're not the main purpose. The main purpose is to get sucked into the sanctus. The main purpose is to be immersed in the worship of the angels and the praises of the saints. And out of that, it's like Fagerberger's saying, out of that comes liturgical theology. Out of that comes a community which is becoming a people who talk about God. And this is rather a lovely, but rather a convicting quote with which I'm pretty much going to finish. He finishes off by saying, I'm not worried that we fail to find ourselves caught up in the holiness around the throne of God every time we share in the liturgy. My worry is that we appear not to expect it ever to happen. We are not yearning for it. We've lost sight of it as the crown of our worshipping endeavour. Do we approach every act of worship either as a member of the congregation going in or logging in or phoning in? Do we approach every act of worship as a worship leader, whether we're an organist or a reader or a priest or a deacon or whatever, expecting that one time out of however many, we may find ourselves caught up in the holiness around God's throne? That's I think the vision for worship. So it is all of those other things that we've talked about. It needs to be balanced. It is part of prayer. It is part of what we do when we try to talk to God together. It is a place for generating liturgical theology, but above all, it is about allowing the kingdom of heaven to enfold us and carry us along. It's the vision of the dome. It's the vision of being lifted up into the place where Christ already is, as paradoxically Christ comes down to the place where we are, and to grasp the heel of heaven. Now, how we do that at the best of times is challenging. How we do that at the worst of times, as we're living through at the moment, is even more challenging. But maybe that just gives you a few starting points for your conversations, and then you can come back and correct me, and challenge me and push back on some of this. But that is, for the moment, where I will pause.
Tom, thank you very much indeed for taking us again into the territory of the work of the angels and grasping the heel of heaven, but keeping our feet firmly on the ground as well. That was really very wonderful. And Tom skipped over a lot of things there, which I know go very deep if we just open the lid on them. And we have got time with Tom a bit later on, after we've had some breakout time, to ask questions, to dig a little bit deeper underneath some of the surface of what he said. So I do hope that you will come up with some questions for him. And to do that, we're going to invite you to join breakout rooms now, rooms of 3 or 4 people. Invite you perhaps to introduce yourselves if you haven't met before, and then consider together what you found helpful or challenging about what Tom has said, and particularly what it is that you would like to ask him in the rest of this session. We'll have about 15 minutes for that, and then we'll bring you back. I invite you to write some questions in the chat. We'll give you a little bit of wriggle time, 5 minutes or so, before we put those questions to Tom. So Molly will now put us into breakout rooms. Thank you, Molly.
Hooray.
Great. Let me just get myself back onto gallery. Great. Thank you. Thank you, Tom.
Yes, I can unspotlight you now, Emma.
Yeah, you can stop recording as well.
Yeah, right.
Thanks.